Hi, my name is Joe Jackson. I'm an interviewer and a broadcaster. And what you're about to hear is one of the 1,400 interviews I did for publications such as the Irish Times, Sunday Independent, Hot Press Magazine, and for RTE Radio 1. How do I know that there are 1,400 interviews exactly? Because I recently digitized all the damn tapes myself. But please remember that many of the interviews were done for the print media and recorded on cassette tapes. So some are, let's say, sonically challenged. But sometimes sonic considerations should give way to historical significance, I believe. And I'm glad to say that at least some powers that be in RTE Radio 1 agreed with me on this, and broadcast between 2015 and 2018 many of my interviews in a series called The Joe Jackson Tapes Revisited. What follows is one such program edited for this podcast and minus music, which I can't use for copyright reasons. The full tapes can be accessed at joejacksoninterviewer.com. Either way, enjoy. Okay, let's say you're a lifelong fan of Leonard Cohen, and if you're listening to this show, you just may see yourself as such. So picture the scene. It's March the 1st, 1985, Dublin, Jury's Hotel. You stride down a corridor so excited that you're finally going to meet Cohen himself. You walk into his room, notice that the 50-year-old Canadian is smaller than he looks on stage and impeccably dressed in the kind of pinstriped suit that would make his late father Nathan, who once owned a clothing store, so proud. He shakes your hand, and within minutes of actually meeting Cohen, you say to him things like, "Get out the Valium and razor blades. LC is back in town. This is the only man the Samaritans ever took out a contract on. See Leonard expire at the National Stadium." Sensitive, eh? Either way, all of that I did say to Cohen near the start of our first interview. How did he respond? Cohen laughed, and he soon understood that there was method to my seeming madness. But let's trace the trajectory of how this, the first of my 3 interviews with Cohen, and one that instantly rerouted my life in the sense that it made me decide to become an interviewer, came about. In fact, let's track that trajectory to what may have been the start of it all for millions of Cohen fans of my generation. So, when did I first hear that song? October the 2nd, 1968, to be as precise as maybe only a diary writer can be. And in my teenage diary on that date, I noted, "Today I bought a fab LP called The Rock Machine Turns You On." It certainly turned me on to Sisters of Mercy. And henceforth, from the time I bought Leonard's first LP, The Songs of Leonard Cohen, to the day I met him in 85 and beyond, I measured my life in line with the release of each one of the man's albums. Likewise, I loved and lived through Leonard's novels and poetry. So in early 85, when I heard Cohen was coming to Dublin again to do a concert, I asked Niall Stokes, editor of Hot Press, for whom I had once been a photographer and recently reviewed Scott Walker's LP Climate of Hunter, to please allow me to interview Cohen. Niall quite rightly reminded me that I wasn't a journalist, and I certainly wasn't an interviewer, but he kindly gave me the gig. So why then did I hit Lenny with those comments? Simply because they had all appeared in the Irish media the week before Cohen arrived, and they struck me as ridiculously reductive. Anyway, here's how Leonard responded to those quotes. Having read them, I asked him if he objected to that kind of publicity or if he nourished it.
Well, first of all, I don't come across it too often.
Do you know?
People hand it to me from time to time for a laugh. But you do get a kind of weary of getting tagged this way.
Yeah.
Especially when the work really isn't like that.
Yeah, right.
If the tag was just a little bit more accurate or had a little bit more to do with the actual feel of the work, you'd say, okay, that's what people have picked up on. But this is something I've got stuck with quite a long time
That's
ago.
right. But you agree that most people do see you in terms of the image that was presented in the early 70s. Tend to associate you, unfortunately, with, it's always Suzanne, Solo, Marianne always has associations with people, whereas all the work that has come since then, and the different genres you have explored, like the rock in 76 and the more classical structure in recent songs, all that stuff seems to be.
Yeah, well, people, you go in and out of fashion, things get hot. And, I came into the music world at a time when there was a bit of a crack in the institutions. Otherwise, I don't think a person like me could have entered the marketplace at all.
Yeah.
So, after that, I think that the music companies pretty well seized control again.
Yeah. Closed up all the cracks.
And they closed up all the cracks, and even there, there's good wine in every generation. There's always going to be good singers.
Yeah. Now, somebody said to me there was the aspect that too many people may have come too young to Cohen. you know, that being set up, like I have an ad that was selling you as the kind of poet turned songwriter for youth, for troubled, inarticulate youth, and you were locked. In many people's minds, you were unfortunately locked there, not thinking that, like, as in the concerns of this or the latest albums are so far removed from that.
Well,
You know, so it's limiting for
very
your audience.
happy to hear you say that, you know, because I don't get that too often. I mean, that's my own view of the thing.
Yeah.
Yo, something I said made Leonard Cohen happy. Yet I know, after revisiting for this show that cassette tape more than 30 years later, I do, of course, see that I made nearly every mistake that can be made by a kid even pretending to be an interviewer. And that, sadly, I still see made by many a seasoned interviewer. Namely, I gave more space at the start to my questions than I gave the Cohen's replies. And I came too close to forcing on the man my perspective on his career, rather than allowing him to articulate it for himself. But hey, the gods were kind to me that day, if only in the sense that what I was saying seemed to echo so many of Cohen's own beliefs. Either way, sticking with my little thesis, I then went on to tell Lenny that a lady friend of mine had said to me the night before the interview, "Oh, I went through Cohen 10 years ago." That made him smile. And she suggested that his concerns seemed to be more those of a man aged half his years. She might not have realised, I now said to Leonard, that he himself obviously had matured over the intervening years, and that a song from his latest LP, such as Night Comes On, which is about the death of his mother, and that to me was its most moving track, clearly reflects more so the emotional reality of a man aged 50. I then suggested that often Cohen's concerts can be elevating and cathartic, and that people leave feeling incredibly joyful. Yet still in the press there seems to persist in advance those notices like, "Get out the razor blades." I said, I think if there was some way it could be attacked, as in that stereotypical image. And Leonard's reply instantly sent me to war for him in that sense, from then till now.
I would love it. I would love it to be attacked. I mean, even the review in the London Times after my Odeon Hammersmith concerts, you know, he spent, and I'm not trying to knock journalists, I've been one myself,
Yeah, right.
but, you know, after 25 or 30 years in this racket, you get to read the reviewers as a critic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see, like, how they write, how they perceive things. And when I read a review, he's on trial. But he spent the first half of the review talking about this old image of the bed sit and the despair and everything like that. And then he spent a few paragraphs saying how incredibly different. He said, "This is slander." But that was like 3/4 of the way through the thing. Because
Many people wouldn't go beyond that point.
Right.
Having read that Cohen preferred to hear how his songs influence listeners rather than be asked what the songs meant, I asked him if he'd ever heard of a listener twisting his or her perspective out of shape to suit one of his songs. I said that I myself, for example, always related to Bird on a Wire, and came to believe that I too had torn every one who reached out for me. But that later, when Cohen sang on live songs the same track and added the lines, "It was the shape of our love twisted me," this gave me an added perspective on the song, and by extension, on what I perceived to be my tendency.
Love is always a dangerous thing. When you fall in love with a song or with a writer and he affirms certain feelings you have, there is always that possibility you're going to get stuck in that feeling. For instance, I love the poems of Lorca. I first read them when I was 15, 16, and they did touch me so deeply that I did look at a lot of things that way.
Yeah.
Then you change, and maybe you discard the poet for a while. And then you come back to him and you realize, well, he wasn't really saying that at all. He was saying something else. So, I mean, we move in and out of love of these spirits that touch us.
Yeah. But you didn't grow beyond Lorca.
No, and I'm always amused when somebody says they've grown out of Dylan or they've grown out of Dante.
Although earlier I had said I felt Cohen is too often perceived only in relation to his first 3 albums, The Songs of Leonard Cohen, Songs from a Room, and Songs of Love and Hate, I did at this point in the interview back refer to Songs from a Room. Cohen once claimed that the album was unloved, but that as more people crack up, its resonance will increase. Mightn't the same thing I said to him apply to all his work, be it dark, light, and or all shades in between? Incidentally, when I asked Leonard that question, he fell silent for about half a minute. So I said, "It was written at a particularly bad time in your life, apparently."
Whatever the conditions of my own personal life have been, I've never had the notion of a disposable song. that this is just tossed off and it's going to be a hit or not a hit or whatever the thing is. Maybe it's because I was trained as a young writer and a poet with some very diligent fellow writers in Montreal when I was a kid, where the enterprise was taken very seriously. So I've never had this idea of disposable art, which had a certain kind of vogue at a certain time. I always meant my stuff to last, as long as it deserved to last. It's lasted about as long as the Volvo lasts.
Yeah, but it did say, I think in The Enemy this week, that songs like Avalanche would carry deeper resonance for more people now than perhaps in the kind of maybe naive optimism of the late 60s, early 70s.
Well, I always wrote, there was always a side of me, maybe, I don't know what you could call it, immodest or maybe trying to be really truthful. There's always some line in all my books saying, you're going to get to this place, and you're going to know that I'm not lying to you.
Yeah.
And that has come about in a number of pieces.
Well, that's in the new album, isn't it? I didn't come to fool you.
Yeah, exactly.
During a recent Cohen interview I'd read around that time, I'd noted that he and the interviewer hit a verbal wall because the journalist in question protested that he couldn't understand certain Cohen lyrics. He obviously was operating along the lines of, what does the song mean, Lenny? Leonard told him, if a song has interior integrity, it will connect. And he said he prefers not to analyse. So might this, I now ask Cohen, stem from a fear that if he imposes his own theory on the meaning of a song, it could impede the flow between the singer and the listener?
No, the real reason is that I don't have any theories. For the purposes of a conversation with people who are interested, who are so kind to be interested in me, and I'm really serious about that, because I've never gotten over the fact that I've been able to survive as a singer. I've seen many great singers go down for one reason or another, and I'm very grateful to be able to go on. I want to make that very clear. So I'm not speaking from a point of view of someone who expects to have attention paid to him. I don't. I'm surprised and I'm gratified by it. What did you say that led me off into that diversion?
About the song having interior integrity, the imposing of your own theory.
Yeah, so the reason there are some people who can talk about their work well. The reason I don't like to talk about it is because I can't talk about it well. I don't have ideas about it. I have to rack my mind just for the purposes of decent human conversation when I speak to really interested people. I'm much more interested in their opinions about the thing. Then sometimes I get surprised. I say, oh, really? Do you think that? Or is that what you think? Because the truth of the matter is that I don't have any opinions about the work. Everything I've got to say is in it.
Is in the song. Is in it.
And it's very difficult for me to make a commentary on it. I was never good at that in college or at school. I was never good at, I felt that I perceived poems and pieces of literature that I read, that I perceived them very deeply and that they touched me very deeply. But I was very hard-pressed
to step back
and to say why something was good or bad. I have a certain technician's interest in a song, in another man's song. I say, yeah, that's well constructed, or he's putting us on here, or that line's just carpentry, or that's padding, or that's beautiful. On that technical level, I can feel it in another man's work, and I can feel it in my work. I can say, that line's weak, but I couldn't come up with anything better.
Yeah.
From the technical point of view, I can look at things, but from the point of view of what it really means, I can't find the meaning out beyond the thing itself.
You had said one of the impulses is to articulate an interior landscape. So perhaps if that's what it is, there is no way one could, stand beyond. I could never do that as a writer either. I can't kind of stand back from a poem if someone says, what does it mean?
If it works, that the meaning of it is that it works.
Yeah.
It's like hearing the harmonic on a violin. It's like hearing some note that goes right through you. I mean, there's, I suppose you could put it through some kind of machine and find out what the sound waves are. But it doesn't really have anything to do with the fact that this guy played this note that went right through you.
Yes, I did mention there my own poetry, which I rarely do in public, and if you read it, you'd know why. But it seemed right to do so to Cohen, given that he was one of the main reasons I began to write poems. But back to his poetry. Minutes later, I reminded Leonard that he'd once said some themes are best left to analysis via poetry, and that we should respect the privacy of the material. But couldn't one also say that although Cohen may create a poem in silence, he violates that silence by publishing, and thus runs the risk of collisions during interviews?
That's true.
Because you often don't like, particularly of poetry as opposed to song, the privacy. It comes very near, I think you said somewhere, violation.
I think that there's a natural appetite for conversation. You know, men have been talking to each other this way for a long time. It says in the Bible, it's not good that man should be alone. We are meant to talk to one another. And there are all kinds of conversations. And one of the conversations is that conversation that takes place on the page of a book. It's very different from a song.
Yeah.
And it's very private.
Here we come to what to me is a pivotal, hugely influential and revealing part of my first conversation with Cohen. But it's something I have to paraphrase largely because the sound on the tape really is lousy at this point. You must remember that these tapes were made originally for print. But back in '85, an Irish publisher was interested in publishing a book I'd written about how my first pop hero, Elvis, became a kind of spirit guide to me growing up. I told Cohen about the hugely autobiographical nature of the book, but said I was fearful of violating the privacy of the material and of leaving myself vulnerable. I was then about to ask how he dealt with that in relation to his novel The Favourite Game, but Leonard cut across and said,
I think you should do it. Myself.
Yeah, but mustn't one have responsibility for the pain one could cause to one's family, I said to Cohen. He had written in his book Death of a Ladies' Man that names had been changed, but was that really enough to avoid causing pain or embarrassment or whatever?
Well, that's a decision that nobody can make, but it is a consideration that has stopped a lot of people from writing. And I think that it may qualify you as a decent man, but it doesn't qualify as a writer. There's no reason that a writer has to be a decent man. There is an element of ruthlessness, because you've got to write about the things that you know.
Well, there seems to be a huge element almost of cannibalism, you know, that you want us to...
Vampirism, cannibalism.
Yeah. Have you had that accusation?
I have. My family was very hurt when I published The Favourite Game, which was about growing up in Montreal.
Yeah. It was your mother was hurt, or...
My mother was hurt less than my uncles and some other members of my family.
That question of the cannibalistic nature of artists, a subject I first saw addressed mercilessly in Ingmar Bergman movies such as Through a Glass Darkly, would become a recurrent area of exploration during my interviews. For example, Tom Murphy would later say to me, I'd step over the body of a bleeding woman in order to finish a play. Having read that quote, John McGahern years later again responded by saying, I'd tear down the Sistine Chapel to save a bleeding woman. And later again, John Banville joked, it depends on the woman. But to get back to Cohen, 85 style, soon afterwards his tour manager, I think it was Jeff, arrived to tell me my time was just about up. Worse still, he sat in on the rest of the interview and I felt made Cohen and I feel more self-conscious than we had been just sitting there chatting like, well, a Zen teacher and his doe-eyed pupil.
Okay, would you really trade all the poetry you've written for a spirit that is Cohen?
I think I would do that anytime.
Yeah, on the new, just to end up with the new album, with the track Your Father's Gone A-Hunting, is it still a case of those who must live forever, everything they cannot control?
You know, because people live a life of the heart, and the heart cannot be mastered, it leads us into many twists and turns. None of them is definitive. There are times, you know, there are times you hate your children, there are times you hate your wife. That feeling of hatred is absolutely valid, it's true. You're seized by it. You can't talk your way out of it or think your way out of it. It's just like love. It's powerful. And because song or art or even ordinary human behavior comes out of the heart, comes out of those emotions. We tend to define ourselves by those. The only thing that changes as you get older and you not master the heart, but put the heart in a certain kind of perspective, is you start forgiving yourself and others for the powerful emotions that you have about them.
And that's why
Not that the emotions change. It's just that an element of forgiveness starts to take place. You put it in perspective. You say, well, I can't stand my wife today, but I know that isn't because, she's evil and I hate her. Or I can't stand my kid today doesn't mean he's a bad kid.
it's just today.
It's just a day.
That's why the darker aspect of the book Death of a Ladies' Man, like the hateful seizures that you say one must give into or often give into, you find as valid as expressions of love, or are expressions of love.
And that's why I set up that book with a mirror commentary on the other side, so that all those emotions were compromised by their contrary possibilities.
Was there also an aspect of trying to, as has been said, beat the critics to the punch? Did you feel you had to defend?
Well, I had been getting such bad press for so long that, I took a stance in that book, Death of the Ladies' Man, that I was the greatest writer of the age.
Yeah, stylist of Herrera.
And the only honest man in town.
Yeah, right.
But that was a humorous stance.
I know. But do people take those seriously? That's what I was thinking. Many critics are going to dive in on that line and say, is this what he's claiming? And not see the humor, not see the stance you are taking.
Well, a lot of people, refused to see the humor of the book, but a lot of the people that read it had a few good laughs.
By this stage, I began to suspect that Jeff, who was standing behind me, might have one of those hooks that are used to haul an actor off a stage, and that he was about to slap it around my neck. I said, just about 3 more questions? Cohen replied, okay, let's tie it up. And when I said to Jeff, is that all right? He replied, ominously, yes. But I had every intention of tossing out questions until I was tossed out of that room.
One tribute you made to your mother was that, I think after her death, that you said that she produced the last album. I get a sense of her presence again on Go Back to the World.
Yes, that is about my mother, yes, that first verse.
But also the presence of perhaps your heritage, your race.
Yeah, oh yes, that's all operating in that song.
Is it? And is there one element in the Go Back to the World, could that be reflected too in the accessibility of the songs, that perhaps these are the most accessible songs?
Well, I'm just at a point where I want to, it's not even I want to, that I am speaking simply so that I myself can understand what I'm saying.
One song or one poem by which you could be remembered, what would they be? Or a line you could pass on perhaps to your children or to your admirers?
Well, I think in that song that you like, that When the Night Comes On, there's a couple of lines there. I'm sure they don't stand as great poetry, but they do stand as good information. And that's the lines, here's to the few who forgive what you do, and the fewer who don't even care.
At that point, zipping to my last typed question, I sent a coded message to Cohen by quoting Nietzsche's line, "The pupil repays his master badly by always remaining a pupil." Then, paraphrasing Leonard's song Teachers, I asked, "Are your lessons done?" Cohen smiled and said, "Well, I got thrown out of the monastery." And knowing I probably was about to get thrown out of this monastery, I said, "Do you want to leave it there?" Cohen said, "Yes." I replied, "Thank you." Leonard then said, "Thanks a lot, man," laughed, and added, "It was a great, great interview, one of the most." And at that point, Jeff cut across and said, "Certainly deep, wasn't it?"
It was deep, and it was, I had a sense that it was important, that you really gone into the work, and I appreciate it.
It is important for me, apart from just for the magazine, just on a purely personal level. So I think maybe that's what came across.
No, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the magazine.
Is it any wonder that as I headed back down the corridor of that hotel, I couldn't feel my feet touch the floor? I felt positively transcendent. In fact, when my girlfriend approached me in the lobby, she said, "Joe, you look different. Did something go wrong?" I said, wrong. No, on the contrary, I never felt so right in my life. Later that night, I wrote to Cohen a poem asking, rhetorically of course, if he could possibly understand how much it meant to me as a fan of his for 17 years to hear him say things like speaking man to man. Then, clearly on a maybe self-deceptive high, I wrote in my diary the following. He came through. Thus begins my career as an interviewer. You could say that today I arrived. Right. Okay, where had I arrived? Probably just at that page in my diary. But more seriously, my meeting with Cohen, and most especially that feeling of transcendence, made me feel that I'd finally found my calling in life and must now go out in search of more of my heroes to interview. Hi, Joe Jackson here again. I thank you for listening to this edition of the Joe Jackson Interviews podcast. More can be heard on my website, joejacksoninterviewer.com.